Hello, everyone. Today, let's talk about a shadow fleet hunt taking place in the Indian Ocean. Today, the United States seized an oil tanker in the Indian Ocean that was transporting crude oil from Iran to China. This is the second time this week that the U.S. Navy has seized an Iranian oil tanker, which has long been traveling between Iran and China in violation of sanctions. These two actions mark the Trump administration's blockade campaign in the Strait of Hormuz. The blockade has extended from the Persian Gulf to the global high seas. The invisible transport routes of Iran's shadow fleet are being torn open one by one. This is not just military law enforcement, but a critical escalation in the energy war. It puts Iran's last cash flow at risk of a steep drop and further increases the energy risks faced by the Chinese Communist Party. All right, now let's talk about these two cruise ships that have been detained. The cruise ship that was seized by the U.S. military today is called the Majestic X. The official X account of the U.S. Department of Defense released a video saying that the U.S. military carried out a maritime interception and boarding operation in the Indian Ocean between Sri Lanka and Indonesia and successfully boarded this sanctioned stateless cruise ship. The original name of this ship was Phoenix, and it used to fly the flag of Guyana. In 2024, it was placed on the U.S. Treasury Department's sanctions list. The ship was fully loaded with Iranian crude oil, and its destination was Zhoushan, Zhejiang, China. This is the second Iranian oil tanker intercepted by the U.S. military in the Indian Ocean this week. The U.S. military stated that international waters cannot become a safe haven for sanctioned actors, and that they will target ships providing material support to Iran anywhere in the world. The first one was the Tiffany, which was seized by the U.S. military in the Indian Ocean this Tuesday. The Tiffany is an old cruise ship built in 1923, originally constructed in Malaysia. Since 2020, it has changed its name and flag multiple times, and now it is in a stateless condition. The United States had already imposed sanctions on it as early as 2025, accusing it of participating in ship-to-ship oil transfers with other sanctioned vessels in the waters east of Singapore. These oil transfers are a key part of how shadow fleets conceal the origin of the oil. So what about this ship? It has been transporting Iranian crude oil to Chinese ports for a long time. According to data from Stanford University, this ship has visited Chinese ports at least 10 times. Let me explain what ship-to-ship oil transfer means, or to use the technical term, ship-to-ship transshipment. There is a scenario described in an indictment by the U.S. government that can help us understand this process. It says that a ship named Oman Pride loaded Iranian crude oil at Siri Island in the Persian Gulf. Meanwhile, another vessel outside the Gulf was sending false signals, pretending to be the Oman Pride. Afterwards, the Iranian crude oil was unloaded from the real Oman Pride and transferred to another ship, which then transported it to China. By pulling off this deception, the ship outside the Gulf could claim it had never been to Iran and that it wasn't carrying Iranian crude oil. Both of the ships seized by the U.S. military this week are members of Iran's shadow fleet. It is this very fleet that supports the oil trade between Iran and its number one customer, the Chinese Communist Party. The U.S. dollar's global interception operations have begun to expose the movements of this secret fleet to broad daylight. The head of a project at Stanford University that tracks China's maritime activities made an interesting comment. He said, "It's like driving on the same road every day and always seeing the same person illegally driving in the carpool lane, time and again, until one day you finally see him get pulled over by the police." Now, this shadow fleet is absolutely massive in scale. According to an organization called United Against Nuclear Iran, or UANI, they have provided estimates suggesting that if you take into account the entire support network, the number of vessels in this shadow fleet exceeds 500, and the core operating tankers of the shadow fleet number over 200. The establishment of this shadow fleet is closely linked to the Chinese Communist Party. For example, one of the networks established in 2019 and headquartered in China now owns at least 56 vessels and has already transported over 400 million barrels of oil to China. This shadow fleet is mainly composed of old VLCC oil tankers, relying on turning off the AIS transponder system, flying false flags, conducting ship-to-ship transfers, which we just mentioned, as well as using fake documents and other methods. For years, it has disguised Iranian crude oil as originating from Malaysia or Indonesia and continuously shipped it to China. According to UNI's data, there are still vessels floating at sea right now. That's over 160 million barrels of Iranian crude oil. This, in effect, serves as Tehran's floating insurance. But now that the United States has expanded its enforcement area to the Indian Ocean, this floating oil has instead become a floating target. If the fleet is continuously dismantled, it will deal another major blow to Iran's cash flow. So what about the impact on China? China is the world's largest oil importer, with daily imports reaching as high as 12 million barrels. Before the war, China imported about 1.4 million barrels of crude oil from Iran every day, which accounted for roughly 12% of its total imports. Almost all of this crude oil was transported by the shadow fleet to evade sanctions. The 160 million barrels floating at sea in the form of Iranian crude oil are equivalent to 114 days of China's oil imports. So if the US military continues to blockade, intercept, or even seize this shadow fleet, it will have a huge impact on this portion of China's crude oil imports. In fact, a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz would have a huge impact on the Chinese Communist Party. Nearly half of China's crude oil imports come through this strait. Aside from the 12% of crude oil that comes from Iran, another 38% comes from other Gulf countries. So after the outbreak of war, China's imports from the 6 Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and others, would drop sharply by more than 50%. Plus, imports from Iran would also drop sharply. So if originally the Chinese Communist Party 50% of its crude oil imports pass through the Strait of Hormuz, and the blockade of the strait causes this 50% to be cut in half, that means there would be about a 25% shortfall in China's crude oil imports. Currently, by relying on strategic reserves, increasing imports from Russia and the United States, releasing commercial inventories, promoting electric vehicles, and maintaining an energy structure where coal accounts for more than half, the Chinese Communist Party can barely keep supply at over 80% of normal levels. However, in the long run, shortages of petrochemical raw materials and the impact of oil prices on manufacturing and people's livelihoods will create enormous pressure. In contrast, a blockade of the strait would have little impact on the United States and might even bring additional benefits. The biggest difference between China and the US is that the US is the world's largest oil producer, while China is the world's largest oil importer. In 2025, the United States will produce as much as 13.5 million barrels of crude oil per day, making it the world's largest producer, more than 3 times that of China. China produces 4 million barrels of crude oil per day domestically, so it needs to import an additional 12 million barrels. In other words, over 70% of its required crude oil, between 70% and 75%, needs to be imported. Let me clarify some concepts first. Crude oil and refined oil are 2 different things, and crude oil itself is divided into light crude and heavy crude. Before the war, the United States exported 4 million barrels of crude oil per day. But at the same time, it also imported about 6 million barrels of crude oil per day. This is because what it exports and imports are different types. It exports light crude oil and imports heavy crude oil. The crude oil that the US exports is mainly domestic shale oil, which is mostly light crude. Many of America's large refineries are specifically designed to process heavy crude, so light crude doesn't match well with these refineries. As a result, this light crude is directly exported. This is a typical processing model known as buying heavy oil and selling light oil. The US imports heavy crude from countries like Canada and Venezuela. Heavy crude oil is then supplied to refineries specifically designed for processing heavy oil. After refining, the products, such as gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel, are exported. The United States is both an importer and exporter of refined oil products, exporting about 7 million barrels per day. Now, due to the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, shale oil producers have increased their output, and the export of this light crude oil has already exceeded 5 million barrels per day. Although the war has also caused domestic oil prices in the United States to rise, oil prices were actually higher 4 years ago in 2022. In the past, the price per gallon of gasoline even reached $4. So overall, today's oil prices in the United States are actually affordable for the general public, and America's energy independence and export capacity put it in a position of advantage during this crisis. In addition, I'd also like to talk about the impact of this crisis, this war involving Iran, on other Asian countries, especially Japan and South Korea. Japan, for example, relies on Middle Eastern oil for over 90% of its supply, and almost all of it passes through the Strait of Hormuz. At the beginning of the war, Japan had 28 oil tankers stranded in the Persian Gulf. However, Japan possesses the world's largest strategic oil reserves, which is equivalent to 254 days of domestic consumption. Of course, China's oil reserves are quite large, but China's strategic oil reserves only account for just over 100 days of its domestic consumption, so it's less than Japan's. This is why, for Japan, having the largest strategic oil reserves, enough for 254 days of consumption, is significant. So far, it has only used about 40 days' worth of its oil reserves. Japan has also allocated 50 million pairs of plastic gloves from its national reserves to support medical institutions. At the same time, it is accelerating imports from countries such as the United States and Canada. Japanese officials, due to political concerns, are unwilling to publicly call on the public to conserve. However, in reality, through such diplomacy and diversification, the conflict has already been kept within a manageable range. At least so far, it remains bearable. South Korea, on the other hand, has been even more proactive. In the early stages of the war, the South Korean government asked the public to shorten their shower times, required civil servants to drive every other day, implemented a fuel price cap, and even restarted nuclear reactors ahead of schedule. This month, the National Assembly approved an emergency relief package exceeding $17 billion, which includes providing up to $400 in cash subsidies for low-income individuals. Diplomatically, South Korea has sent special envoys and conducted intensive visits to Gulf countries such as the UAE, Oman, and Saudi Arabia. As a result, they have secured 24 million barrels of emergency crude oil supplies and signed long-term contracts for 273 million barrels of crude oil and 2 million tons of naphtha through the end of the year. As the world's largest exporter of aviation fuel, South Korea is also cooperating with these countries to build storage facilities and alternative transport routes. As a result, Lee Jae-myung's approval rating has risen to a new high since taking office. Of course, the war has highlighted the vulnerability of global energy security under the influence of geopolitics. In the long run, finding alternatives to the Strait of Hormuz is imperative. Currently, the existing bypass pipelines, including Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline, have a maximum transport capacity of 7 million barrels per day. The UAE also has a pipeline to Fujairah, which can transport about 1.1 to 1.5 million barrels. And there's also a pipeline with a capacity of 1.5 million barrels. Iraq has pipelines as well, and so on. Altogether, these can transport up to 9 million barrels of crude oil per day at most. However, this is still far below the previous normal flow through the Strait of Hormuz, which was 20 million barrels per day. Nevertheless, these alternative pipelines can help alleviate the situation. In addition, many expansion projects are being accelerated, and new plans are also underway. This includes the Iraq-Jordan Red Sea pipeline, Saudi Arabia's new pipeline, the expansion of Omani ports, and even more ambitious projects like the UAE's Inland Canal, all being put on the table. Israel, for its part, is also openly promoting a regional multi-pipeline network, hoping to completely reduce dependence on the strait. In the short term, there is still no perfect substitute for the Strait of Hormuz. However, the crisis has already pushed Gulf countries to move from just talking about bypassing the strait to actually taking action. The most pragmatic long-term approach is to expand existing pipelines and, in addition, to build new regional pipeline networks combined with global supply diversification, which can gradually reduce dependence on a single strait. Completely breaking free may take a decade, 5 to 10 years, or perhaps even longer. This will also require a significant amount of time and huge investments, but the direction is already very clear. All right, now back to the ceasefire. At present, it seems that the US counter-blockade of Iranian ports is a clever move, achieving the greatest effect with the smallest input. This is also the best way to deal with Iran's asymmetric warfare. Escort missions are difficult, but blockades are easy. Before the US used this tactic, Iran was choking the global economy by threatening to block the Strait of Hormuz. Only Iranian ships were still able to pass through unimpeded. Now, with this move, the US is also choking Iran's economy. Iran is a major oil producer. Oil exports account for 80% of its total exports, 60% of government revenue, and 25% of its GDP. So the importance of the strait to Iran's economy or rather Iran's dependence on this narrow waterway, is higher than anyone else's. Trump closed the strait, ensuring that Iran could not profit from exporting oil. So, if the blockade continues, can Iran really withstand it? A veteran investor wrote that Iran's own oil storage facilities are about to reach full capacity. Once the tanks are full, the regime will have only two options: either surrender and reach an agreement with the United States, or stop production at its own oil wells. The problem with the second option is that it's very difficult to reverse. Shutting down an oil well that is in production usually damages it, and this kind of damage is permanent, making it very difficult to restart later. Iran will face enormous long-term problems. In addition, Iran relies on a massive workforce to maintain control over the country. There are police everywhere monitoring protests, internet usage, citizens' clothing, and even Iranian women's hair. This kind of control is very costly, and if the government loses 60% of its revenue, that means many of these stability-maintaining enforcers will lose their salaries. So how much longer can they keep working under those circumstances? This analyst said, I don't know how this conflict will end, but I do know that President Trump and the U.S. Navy have already turned Iran's greatest strategic advantage into a huge weakness. In addition, I also saw some analysts say that if the blockade lasts for 2 to 4 weeks, Iran's oil exports will come to a complete halt. Iran's currency, called the rial, will collapse even faster. Food shortages will worsen, and the government will begin to delay salary payments. If the blockade lasts for 1 to 2 months, foreign exchange reserves will be severely depleted, hyperinflation will rise sharply, more industries will halt production, and protests are more likely to break out. If the blockade lasts for 2.5 to over 3 months, the losses will approach $56 billion for the year, which is the entire budget of the Iranian government. The risk of government collapse and large-scale unrest would rise significantly. Of course, Iran still has foreign exchange reserves, overland trade, and its shadow fleet as buffers. However, the direct impact of a military blockade would far exceed that of the sanctions imposed over the past 40 years. When members of the shadow fleet are hunted down globally, Iran's floating income will also dry up. Additionally, the true extent of the impact also depends heavily on how strictly the blockade is enforced. Currently, there are differing opinions regarding the effectiveness of the U.S. military's blockade. According to Lloyd's List Intelligence, a British maritime intelligence agency, it uses tracking data from ships at sea, including AIS signals, intelligence from shipbrokers, satellite imagery, port entry and exit records, and so on. A comprehensive analysis suggests that since the US blockade began on April 13th, at least 26 ships associated with Iran's shadow fleet have already crossed the blockade line. Among these, 11 are carrying these are tankers carrying Iranian oil or petroleum products. However, the US Central Command issued a statement saying that no ships have breached the blockade. In a statement released yesterday, the Central Command said that in the past 24 hours, some media outlets reported that several commercial vessels had successfully evaded the blockade, citing, for example, the Hero 2, the Hedi, and the Dorina. However, these reports are not accurate. The Hero 2 and the Hedi did not form a convoy to transport millions of barrels of oil into the market. In fact, after these two Iranian-flagged tankers were intercepted by the US military earlier this week, they are currently docked at Iran's Chabahar port, while the Dorina is being escorted by a US Navy destroyer in the Indian Ocean. Previously, it had attempted to break the blockade. The command said that the US military possesses global operational capabilities, and US forces are carrying out and enforcing this blockade in the Middle East and beyond. Currently, the US military has deployed more than 11,000 personnel, over 100 fighter jets, and more than 17 warships for the blockade. With such forces, blockading the narrow passage of the Strait of Hormuz is not a difficult task. All right, that's all for now about the US-Iran war. There's another matter today that's also worth mentioning. It's about a Vietnamese American named Carlos Del Toro. If we translate his name into Chinese, it might be Chow Hong. He is the new acting U.S. Secretary of the Navy. Yesterday, on Wednesday, the U.S. Department of Defense suddenly announced that the current Secretary of the Navy would step down immediately. The Department of Defense spokesperson, Sean Pennell, posted on X stating that Secretary Palin has already left the government. We thank him for his contributions and wish him all the best in the future. At the same time, it was announced that former Undersecretary of the Navy, Cao Hong, would immediately take over as acting Secretary of the Navy. At such a sensitive moment, the shake-up in the Navy's top leadership has drawn a lot of attention. Although the authorities have not publicly disclosed the specific reason for Palin's resignation, multiple media outlets report that it was due to serious disagreements between Palin and Defense Secretary Haig Sayers over the Navy's shipbuilding program, as well as issues with internal management style. Ultimately, he was asked to step down immediately. Cao Hong, a Vietnamese American, was born on August 3, 1971, in Saigon, Vietnam, which is now Ho Chi Minh City. After the fall of Vietnam in 1975, he arrived in the United States with his family as a refugee. He was only 4 years old at the time. The whole family started from scratch in the United States, building a new life with nothing. When President Trump nominated him as Undersecretary of the Navy this February, he described him in a post as the embodiment of the American dream. In 2023, when Cao Hong ran for Virginia State Senator, he released a campaign ad recounting his most vivid childhood memories and his journey from a communist country to America to pursue his dreams. It's very moving. Now let me play the beginning part of his video for everyone.
This is the scariest sound you will hear when you live in a communist country. This is the last sound my parents heard when their fathers were taken away in the middle of the night, and they never saw their loved ones again. That's the sound of losing your freedom, the sound of always living in fear. That's my family's real-life story. We escaped from Vietnam just days before Saigon fell to the communists. We were given a new life in the most generous country on earth. America saved my life. I graduated from the United States Naval Academy. I earned a master's in physics and fellowships at MIT and Harvard before the left replaced merit with racial quotas. I spent my life trying to repay my debt to America, my country, our country, with 25 years of service and Navy Special Operations combat in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia. But now our country has changed.
The sound at the beginning of Cao Hong Kai's video, that pounding noise made with a fist, should be the sound of banging on the door. I think that people who have suffered persecution in communist countries will deeply relate to this video. In the video, he explains that after coming to the United States, he was admitted to the US Naval Academy thanks to his outstanding performance. After graduating in 1996, he earned a master's degree in physics and subsequently received fellowships from both MIT and Harvard University. He served in the Navy for a full 25 years, and when he retired, his rank was colonel. During that time, he was involved in naval special operations and was deployed multiple times to Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia to participate in high-risk missions. After retiring, Cao Hong entered politics. In 2024, he ran as the Republican candidate for U.S. Senator from Virginia. Although he ultimately lost to the incumbent Democratic Senator Tim Kaine, his popularity made him a prominent representative of minorities and veterans valued by the Trump camp. In February 2025, Trump officially nominated him to serve as Undersecretary of the Navy. In October, he was confirmed by the Senate with a vote of 52 to 45, becoming the 35th Undersecretary of the U.S. Navy. Just half a year later, he has now become the acting Secretary of the Navy. Cao Hong's story should especially resonate with immigrants from communist countries. In the film, he says, "The most generous country on earth has given us a new life." This sentence expresses the gratitude and sense of mission felt by many families who immigrated to the United States from communist countries. America did not treat them as outsiders. Instead, it provided educational opportunities and a stage, allowing a child who once lost family members under a communist regime was ultimately able to put on the uniform of the U.S. Navy and defend this country. For immigrants from communist China, Cao Hong's experience is even more like a mirror. They have also experienced the fear of authoritarian rule and have witnessed how communist regimes destroy families and strip away freedom. Similarly, they choose to give back to America through their actions. Some go into business, some enter politics, and some join the military. From being a refugee to attending the Naval Academy, from serving in special forces to becoming one of the highest-ranking civilian leaders at the Pentagon, Cao Hong has once again written a legendary chapter of the American dream. He has publicly opposed the left's use of racial quotas in place of merit and expertise, and has repeatedly emphasized the importance of national security and military strength. These positions closely align with the values of many Chinese immigrants. So the Trump administration's choice of Chao Hong was not just a personnel change, but also a highly symbolic move. He is telling the world that America is still a land of opportunity, no matter where you come from. As long as you are loyal to American values and are willing to strive and fight for them, you have the chance to stand on the highest stage. Especially at this sensitive moment, with the ongoing crisis of the Strait of Hormuz blockade against Iran, appointing a special operations veteran with extensive combat experience to lead the Navy sends a strong signal of military preparedness. All right, thank you all for watching. If you enjoy our program, we hope you can like, subscribe, and share it. Additionally, we want to let you know that Fang Fei Time has launched both Cantonese and English channels. If you have friends or family who speak Cantonese or English, we also welcome you to recommend our Cantonese and English channels to them. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.